There's a New Yorker article a while ago called "I'm sick of staring at myself on Zoom," so I always have to cover my face. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So greetings everyone from our little hut, our other room. Today I wanted to try to speak about time. And some of you might know Meister Eckhart. He was a mystic, Christian mystic, I think in the 12th or 13th century. And Rob Rebea speaks about time in a beautiful talk called Time and the Emptiness of Time, and references Meister Eckhart quote where he says something along the lines of, "Nothing blocks light like time. Time is our largest obstacle to God." And he speaks about the parable of Jesus entering the temple and throwing out the money changers as a metaphor for how our bargaining with God for forgiveness, happiness, sanctification only makes God move farther away. Everything we have to bargain with has been given by God in this conception, in the Christian conception. How can we possibly bargain? And this idea that the more one fixates and prays for the sake of that goal, that the farther it recedes because one is bringing in time. And obviously we have to adjust this language for a Buddhist context. Awakening, purity of heart, the present moment, nibbana. These are the contexts and the concepts which we walk in as practitioners of the Buddhist path or of spirituality framed in this language. But it's a similar dynamic where time is what holds up a veil. And when the Buddha speaks about nibbana, awakening, he speaks about it not as the opposite of anicca, impermanence, one of the three characteristics which most of you will have heard. The opposite of anicca, impermanent, would be nicca, permanent. The Buddha defines nibbana, awakening, as ajata. Jati is birth. Ajata is the unborn. Amata, the undying. Asankatang, the uncreated, the unborn, the undying, the uncreated, outside of time. And so often we hear this encouragement to just be in the present moment, to let go of the past and the future. And certainly the Buddha speaks about the need to step away from the fantasies and concerns that haunt us from the past, or regrets or concerns or hopes for the future, and be present with experience as it is, mindful. But he goes one step farther in many suttas and talks about releasing attachment even to the present, because the present is predicated, the present moment, that idea, is predicated on the idea of a past and a future. And if both of those are illusory, then the present also is illusory. The present moment is also an illusory concept because it's based on illusion. And in one sutta, the Buddha speaks about the king of the Asuras, Veppachiti, who is captured by the king of the Devas. The Asuras are sort of the Buddhist equivalent of Titans, and they're always at war with the Devas, the angels, which are roughly the equivalent of the Greek Olympians, Saka, which is Zeus. So they're always kind of battling one another. And Saka catches Vipachitti after one battle and binds him. And in the sutta, the Buddha says that whenever Vipachitti thought the Devas are righteous, the Asuras are unrighteous, I am here in the city of the Devas, in heaven, then his bonds dissolved and he was able to enjoy himself, endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure. Whereas whenever he thought the Devas are unrighteous, the Asuras are righteous, I will go to the city of the Asuras, the bonds would form again and he would be trapped. And what the Buddha says before and following this is, when one falls under the conceiving of oneself in the future, one is struck. And when one conceives in the present, I am this, my form will be this. In the future, my form will be that, or my perception, or so on. In the past, my form was this. Then this is a conceit, a palpitation, a pandita, a perturbation, an injita is the Pali. And the sense that as soon as one binds oneself to a conception of self and an object in the future or the past or the present, I am thus right now, then one has bound oneself to time. And one is like Vipachitti in these bonds, where as soon as he wishes to be elsewhere, then the bonds tighten and he finds himself trapped once again. And only when he releases those conceivings of I wish to go here, these valuations, is he able to understand himself in heaven. And for us, with our much more mundane existences, to understand that these conceivings are what tie us to time, these palpitations, these perturbations, how suffering, conceit, is the coalescing of tension and the releasing of tension. And this is the pulsation that creates time. And that even the present moment is a fraught concept because it rests on an illusory past and future by contrast. And really what we exist in is the space of timelessness. Now, these concepts don't really have the solidity we attribute to them. And even more so when you consider back in the Buddhist time, there was no present moment. That's a concept sort of bound to the idea of a clock and a second hand, which clicks 1, 2, 3, a moment, a pinpoint. Whereas in the Buddhist time, without a clock, without this concept of unified time, it was a much more malleable thing. And when you allow this letting go, you realize that suffering and time are intimately related. It's like a stream, and Ajahn Chah spoke about being like still flowing water. Is that when you see a stream that's perfectly clear, even if it's moving, it looks still. It's only when you see rocks put into the middle that you see the turbulence. And this is suffering. This is the palpitation, the palpitation, the perturbation, the mind quivering with conceit of I will be, or I am, or I was, reaching out, coming in, wishing to be otherwise. This is where time manifests. And to know what it means to let go of that. One lay community member recently was speaking about watching I believe the Mariners have just somehow, they almost got to the playoffs or something like this, I've just heard. And he was speaking to one of his friends who'd been through like sat through like a 15 inning game. It's just apparently really long. And this community member said, really all that watching those 15 innings becomes is just a buildup of like anxiety and tension and a release, and a buildup of anxiety and tension and a release. That is time. And you notice this because the more suffering you have, the stronger the hindrances are, the more you wish it were otherwise, the more you look to the future, to this ending, to time, and you become bound by time. It's like a rock put into that stream of cool water. And interestingly enough, in the hierarchy of the cosmos in Buddhist cosmology, and once again, you don't have to believe in these as literal concepts, but like Longpo Sucitta says, the Buddha had cosmology, we have psychology. But each level you go up, time changes and becomes longer, vaster, smoother. So the lifespan, a day in one of the heaven realms of one of the devas is equivalent to hundreds of years in the human realm. And the Brahmas, these beings of pure luminosity, or the mind state equivalent to that of jhana, deep concentration, is, there's almost no ripples in that water. It lasts for eons, for countless cycles of universe contraction and expansion, the Big Bang and the Big Crunch, whatever you want to call it. And you see that when things are smooth, there's a sense of time doesn't matter in the same way. Longpo Sucitta was once asked about time, and he said, I no longer pay attention to time. All I notice is the fluctuations in the citta, the heart. And in a sense, that's all time is. Fluctuations in the citta. So what happens when you begin to walk in line with Dhamma and your citta stops fluctuating so much and you become like still flowing water? And the line in the sutta says one walks in harmony with Dhamma, in line with Dhamma. Dhammacharya, samacharya. Charya means to act in accordance. Dhamma and sama means harmony, resonance. One acts in accordance with Dhamma, in harmony with Dhamma, and there's no discord. And this is grace in the sense of a dancer. You notice with grace, there's a sense of, it's such a beautiful word and it has so many meanings. And one of them is this sense of you're moving in perfect tune to the music. And there's a sense of timelessness when you see someone doing that. And interestingly, someone has said, I think Mechi Panisiri, that grace in a Buddhist context is Kanti, patient endurance, which is such a terrible translation. Longpo Sumedho says Kanti is peaceful coexistence with the unwished for. And this sense that you can't be patient and be waiting for something to be over at the same time. I mean, you can, but at its deepest you can't, because true patience has a sense of grace and timelessness there. And it's beautiful also in that the Buddha, in Christian terminology, there's two concepts of time. There's chronos, which is quantitative, seconds, minutes, hours, worldly time, and kairos, which is deep time, deep time. And actually the terms originated in the classical world, and kairos was known as a qualitative quality, the time for action. It was the moment in archery, it was the moment when you could release the arrow and it would penetrate through the target, or the exact moment when the shuttle could go through the threads of the loom. And there's this sense, then it got taken up by Christian cosmology and thought as the point where you're touching into God's will, the divine, and something else can move. And it's not just the present moment, that's such a dry word for it, but a sense of kairos, of timeless time, touching into that, the still flowing water, the resonance with Dhamma, of grace, of a sense of being, touching the sacred, and that idea of penetration, whether it be the arrow through the target or the shuttle through the loom, penetrating the conditioned world to something deeper and touching it. And interestingly, it's in The Importance of Ritual. It's a great book. You write, ritual is to time what home is to place. And sometimes these recollections, letting go of the kind of fixations on the past or future, don't always work. But the sense that one can also touch that timeless time by, or that deep time by ritual, and creating a conduit from the conditioned realm to something, a deeper strata of heart. So all that can sound somewhat abstract and poetic. And I think we can wonder, how is this actually relevant to me now? And I'd say the way it's relevant, or one of the best ways I think to touch this for many, although occasionally it's just enough to recollect, okay, I'm getting caught in time. Can I step away from that? I'm getting fixated. I'm seeing the mind crystallize. And to notice the interrelationship of time, self, and thing. When the Buddha says those conceit, those perturbations, those palpitations, my form, in the present, I am thus, I will not be thus. In the future, I am thus, I will not be thus. In that, there's a concept of time, there's a concept of self, and a concept of object and subject, of thingness. And those measurements we create, that tripod, is what holds suffering aloft. The solidification, the reification of time, self, and an object. Measurement, contrast, desire for things to be otherwise. But the clock of time, in the Buddhist thought, the fluctuation of the citta, which causes time, is dependent origination, which appropriately has 12 links, just like the 12 numbers of a clock. So for those of you who don't know, paticca-samuppada is I think one of the most profound psychological models ever developed, that I've ever heard of, at least. And it was when the Buddha speaks about the insights of all Buddhas, of past enlightened beings and him, this was the insight, the origination of suffering. It's Avijja's algorithm. It's the equation, the process, the cascade that leads to suffering and rebirth and becoming and time. It's how that buildup and release of tension happens again and again. It's the clock. And if you're in Bodh Gaya, under the Bodhi tree, every morning and evening, you'll hear this being chanted in Pali. It's so beautiful. So it goes, Avijja pacaya sankhara, ignorance conditions volitional formations. Sankhara pacaya vijnana, volitional formations condition consciousness. Vijnana pacaya namarupa, consciousness conditions name and form. Namarupa pacaya salayatana, name and form condition the six sense bases, which condition contact, which condition feeling tone, vedana, which condition craving, which condition grasping, which condition becoming, which condition birth, which condition, finally, the final link, death, suffering, lamentation, pain, sorrow, and despair, death, the end. And then it begins again. And this sounds very cryptic, but and Ajahn Chah often said, look, you don't have to memorize all of those 12 links. Just know, basically, it's enough to know when you fall off a branch, you hit the ground and it hurts. So, you don't have to count every branch between the one you fall off of and the ground. Just know it hurts and it's going to hurt. And you can tell when you start with ignorance, you're going to end up with suffering. But the Buddha also says in Majjhima Nikaya, if you know the Four Noble Truths at any of these links, you can dismantle the whole process. If you know any of these links clearly, the whole thing falls apart. So we can dismantle the clock, clockwork chitta does not have to dominate us. And as that clock dismantles, you find yourself in timelessness again, for one brief moment at least. And so just to run through these links, there's two ways of interpreting this. And because Buddhist psychology and cosmology is a chaotic system, meaning it's a vortex of shifting conditions, it features different qualities of chaos theory, which include scale invariance, which means a pattern that plays on a small scale will play on a large scale too. So it's true that this cycle of 12 links is in the Buddha's teachings very clearly pointing to how rebirth takes place. Ignorance leads to these momentum, conditional formations, these programs, which then lead to a new birth, and then finally to death, and then another one as well. A 3-lifetime model is how the commentaries usually speak about it. But because of scale invariance, it also applies to every single moment. And this is perhaps the most useful way to apply this for most of us. So ignorance is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, avijja, the first link. And that's the Four Noble Truths as an applied skill. So this means we don't see suffering as suffering. And so because we crave, because we don't see that craving is the source of suffering, we let the mind go out and try to fill in that hole, the quintessential gap. And I think of this often. I've always wondered, how does ignorance lead to sankhara? How does avijja lead to conditional formations? And I think it's, then I found this sutta that says, those recluses that do not see as it is, that all conditional formations are impermanent and suffering. They delight in volitional formation. Delighting in volitional formations, they fall off the edge of volitional formations. And volitional formations here is like intention, going out. Longpo Dun said famously, he reformulated the Four Noble Truths and said, the source of suffering is the mind going outside of itself. The path to the ending of suffering is the mind watching the mind. So I think of this often. Ignorance is the gap, like a stone dropped in water will create a trough. And then sankhara is the water droplet which springs up from that. We feel a gap, and so we go out. And eventually we see that every going out, we're trying to feed the mind and the heart with something that can never feed it. Happiness can only come from within. And yet we keep searching out. And you can just see this very clearly, like you're feeling dissatisfied, so you go see a movie. Whereas often if you just sit there with it and understand, okay, this is dissatisfaction, this hurts, it dissolves. And in the end, the movie just agitates more. But that's what we do. And as we see the Four Noble Truths again and again, we become more skilled at seeing dukkha, stress, the palpitation. We stop sending the mind out as much. And sankhara, intentional formations, lead to consciousness, leads to name and form. And in the context of a daily life, and that leads to the sense bases and contact. So in the sense of a daily life, it's good to know that contact with the sense bases is halfway through the cascade already. And to know that there's a lot of prep work. We don't come into this world as a blank slate. So notice during the day, maybe the ignorance and the sankhara is a sankhara, a pattern of anger. We're dissatisfied, so we feel aversion, or we're dissatisfied, so we feel the mind goes to greed. It wants to fixate on something, to take its, to focus on, or agitation, any of the hindrances really. And that's sankhara. And that conditions our consciousness. So our flavor of consciousness, it's looking for something to be angry at or greedy for. And you know when you wake up and you're like this, the mind, you can feel it right when you wake up, searching for an argument to fixate on, or a thing to look forward to, an addiction, an argument, a plan. And then consciousness leads to name and form. And in the context of the daily life thought, that could be, how does that consciousness affect your mind. It brings up perception, say in anger, of memories of this person, how they were doing this or that, and the body that's form, clenching, the breath becoming tight, a sense of knot in the stomach. And then you have the sense bases and contact. So then, coming into the world, you see that the spouse didn't put away the silverware, or you see the headline, and the mind is already hungry. It's looking for something to be angry at. And so there it is, contact. It leads to Vedana, feeling tone, unpleasant. And then we cling to that. That's tanha. And this is a key point in the chain, because often that Vedana link is where we can stop. Just knowing, unpleasant feeling. When you're angry, just know it hurts to be angry. Ow, like suffering. Or if you've been fixated on the donut you're going to eat for two hours straight, after a while you just realize this is suffering, dukkha. And you can stop it there. That's knowing that link and dismantling the chain. But if you don't dismantle it, if you allow craving to take root, you buy into it. You feed into the fantasy of lust or the donut or the anger. And that leads to clinging, sort of this solidified sense of orientation towards that object, towards the future, towards the past, whatever. And that leads to becoming. And becoming is the crescendo. They've taken note in shopping when peak dopamine is, and it's when you're at the cash register. So this is the moment when you're about, you've decided to eat the donut. You've decided to buy the thing. This is bhava, becoming. It's the crescendo. And to note that moment, feel it. And it can manifest much more subtly. We have a teacher who, whenever he crosses that bhava moment, he'll say, ding, just internally. So whenever you see yourself being the victim or being, feeling a certain amount of like a flush of self-righteous anger or pride or whatever it is, just be like, oh, bhava, ding. And it's like the alarm clock, if we're talking about the clock simile. And then jati is the next link, birth. And that's when you've eaten the donut. It's when you've bought the thing. It's when you've said the words. It's when you've crossed a line that's irreversible, in a sense. And the karma will manifest. You don't want to get to birth if you can stop at bhava. And then, inevitably, of course, it fades. And the next link and the final one is sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. And we all know this one well. How there's a bruising, say, of embarrassment or the regret. And the tendency is so often with remorse, embarrassment, disappointment, regret, to try to rush it, to sort of, if you've done something you wish you hadn't done, to try to think your way out of it, to say, I'll never do that again, and, maybe make some rash determinations, or just try, or if you're regretting something, just to try to rush it along, and it doesn't work. What I notice about that final link is it's a bruise that you have to let move through the body. And the goal is to let it move through, hold it with as much compassion as you can. We're all in this together. And let it fade. And don't jump into a new becoming, because the tendency is to jump into the next thing, the next birth. And what happens if you can just wait? T.S. Eliot says in the Four Quartets, wait without hope, because hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, because love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the hope and the love are all in the waiting. This is khanti. This is patience. Letting the bruise fade and finding on the other side, if you don't buy into it, if you don't jump into another set of becomings, the clock dismantles and there's a sense of grace and spaciousness and sanctity. So I'd say when someone once asked, how do we know if we're really not suffering, if we're really okay, and how do we know if it's actually delusion? And my sense is that as unenlightened beings, if we think we're kind of floating along in a state of non-suffering, I'm okay all the time, odds are it's delusion. And this is why how I think good practice manifests, and one way you know it's real, is if what your practice is watching one of those links in dependent origination, watching the mind clench around it. And then as you see with insight into it, as your patience with it, as you note it, watching the mind and hand release into spaciousness. That process again and again and again, that is practice. Because until we're enlightened, our palsied shaking of the hand will clench again and again. And if we think we're just floating along with an empty, wide open hand of timelessness, odds are we're just deluded. But knowing that clockwork, knowing that we're stuck on that train until full awakening, until we step off again and again, stepping off onto the platform again and again. And that's good practice, and that's timelessness. We touch it through the cracks. We get tastes of it, tastes of something like it at least. And we know that taste by its sense of sanctity, of surrender, of space and spaciousness, and of kind of the sense of smooth flowing water, of grace, of walking in line with Dhamma, and of feeling that our lives are aligned with the deepest level of patterning and aspiration which we can hold. So I want to put that all out there. And then I want to leave with one quote, which I can't kind of get out of my head. It's by Chogyam Trungpa, who is a problematic figure in his own right, but I think had some deep wisdom. He said, the good news is that you've been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. Sorry, the bad news. The bad news is you've been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. The good news is there's no ground. So I'll just leave that and people can chew it over and see if there's a way of relating it to the talk or not. Okay. So we have a chance now for questions. If people want to raise their hands or speak about anything, we have about 20 minutes together. And Doran, if you're able to also look at the YouTube live stream in case there's any chat questions there, then that'll be useful. But people can just raise their electronic hand, and that's how we can see if anyone has something they'd like to talk about. Mary, please. I think you're muted, Mary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. That was really rich talk. So one of the places I get confused about this process of taking birth is that you said the sense contact is halfway there, right? Okay. So, and I know because I work with Vedana quite a lot and it's really helpful, but this is maybe a silly question, but if we're fully enlightened, is there no sense contact?
Oh man. So when we start talking about enlightened consciousness, it sort of becomes, I think, impossible for an unenlightened being to speak about. And I think a lot of these frameworks fall apart. What I will say, I think, is that, an enlightened being, obviously the Buddha continued to navigate the world, and I think enlightened beings do. But once that karma has exhausted itself and they've let go of the body into parinibbana, they don't take birth again. And then there is no sense contact. So at the end of the road, yes, that even falls away. But the residual karma has to be exhausted. And to be careful, like we intuit that, and it's so easy to think of it as a nihilism or a blank emptiness that's replaced that. And the Buddha was very clear that that's not the case. That chain of dependent origination ceases. But what's really unnoticed is when the Buddha gives that chain of becoming, he speaks about the reverse. With the cessation of ignorance, there is the cessation of sankhara, the fading away. So an interesting practice is just to think about, like, what happens when I stop at Vedana and don't go out? What does that feel like? And that cessation cycle is pointing towards awakening. And what there's something there's a signpost there for us if we see that flavor of not becoming into the next chain or the next link. And what a fully enlightened being becomes, the Buddha wouldn't answer that because it was beyond words. So good question and an impossible question. Well done, Mary. But yeah, at some level, Buddha, an enlightened being stops taking birth. So, Kate.
Thank you for that really, really rich and lovely talk, Ajahn, on time and dependent origination and patience. And it so happens that I was on a Zoom earlier this morning with Venerable Analio, and he was talking about time.
What did he say?
Well, this is just briefly. This was one thing that he said. He said that caught my ear. He said, "Time is our experience of change."
Yeah.
Time is our experience of change.
Yes.
And that really struck me. And I began thinking, time is what this way of looking of time, this fabrication of time, is exactly what allows us to perceive impermanence. If we are looking with eyes, if we are looking with eyes of time, fabrication, then we can perceive impermanence, right?
Yes.
Seems to me. And similarly, so if we're looking through the eyes of time, through the fabrication of time, then all of those links of dependent origination presume time. They wouldn't exist outside the framework of time. And similarly with the idea of patience. The idea of patience also depends on looking through the eyes of time, especially linear time. And I'm looking outside right now. I'm on Whidbey Island at home, and I'm looking at the trees, and I'm thinking not only linear time, that from here I'm going to go and I'm going to do this and that and the other thing, but also the trees are reminding me that we can also look at time in a circular way. The leaves are falling off the trees right now. The trees are going to be bare soon. Then in the spring, the leaves are going to come back. So nature to me speaks of circular time, not linear. So I think there are different ways of looking at time as well. All this to say that it seems to me that what we're talking about is something within the conditioned world, that time, all of these things depend on time, and time exists within the conditioned world. And for the enlightened ones, maybe that framework of the conditioned world isn't there, and so that I don't know. I guess I get confused. I wonder if you have any comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kate. And, just to acknowledge you're part of leading our Rob's Mob book group, and Rob Burbea's talk on this is the inspiration, just brilliant. You can find it on Dharma Seed. Two things. One is there's a beautiful sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya where the Buddha says, whether or not a Tathagata arises in the world or doesn't arise in the world, this element persists, the thusness of Dhamma, the not otherwiseness of Dhamma. That is that conditionality. Titava sadatu, dhammatitata, dhammaniyamata, itapachayata. And they're almost these three counterpoints to the three characteristics we all know of anicca, dukkha, anatta, where those things are all about how the world's shifting and changing, and our experience of time, you're right, is completely predicated on that contraction and palpitation. But here the Buddha is pointing to a sense of the orderliness of Dhamma, and the sense that even if you distill down all those motions of time, you're right, the 12 links are time bound, but the quintessential algorithm of that conditionality that underlies even that is timeless. It's an eternal law. This is how conditioned conditions work. And the more you tap into that, the more I think those three characteristics almost counterbalance our sense of the other three, where you're right, we still perceive time, but I think this touches what Longpo Suchitta was saying, that more and more his experience became that of the movement of the Citta, where if you're tapped into, there's just that sense of, okay, it's like this, it's like this, it's painful now, it's not. The more you have wisdom around that process and that sense of orderliness of Dhamma, then the less your heart is moved, and the more the sense of time kind of disappears. Even though the external conditions shift constantly, these three characteristics of the thusness of Dhamma, the orderliness of Dhamma, that conditionality, are stable, and there's not that movement. So I think there is a balance there, and and as to an enlightened being, I mean, who knows? But certainly, I think we can all sense that motion of like that sense of harmony, or knowing that deeper level of stability, changes the sense of time. And the one final thing I'd say is there's a state adjacent to awakening called Sanya Vedaita Nirodha, the cessation of feeling and perception. It's considered sort of the ninth immaterial, or the ninth attainment above all the jhanas. And it's said to be attained only by anagamis and arahants, so fully enlightened beings and near that. And in one of the and it's timeless. You have to, in the Majjhima Nikaya 43, Venerable Sariputta says you have to determine before you go in when you'll come out, because time disappears. And I've heard teachers talk about it, and they sort of talk about the sense of time is gone completely. And what's so interesting is in Majjhima Nikaya 44, Venerable Dhammadina, this wonderful bhikkhuni, foremost in teaching Dhamma, says that when someone emerges from that, they have three different perceptions, sort of three doorways to the deathless. Either they perceive emptiness, sunyata, and the commentaries say that that's if they've been focused in their practice on anatta. So you'll know people like this, where they're always thinking about not self, and somehow the perception of space, emptiness, is very relevant to them. Or their doorway to the deathless is animitta samadhi, signless, and that's if they've been focused on impermanence, anicca. And you'll know people like that, where they're always focused on how things rise and fall. This is like Mahasi, dry insight. And somehow the sense of not clinging to signs, they just come up, things come and go. And then the third is their doorway to the deathless is, or the sort of perception is apanahito, which is undirected. And that's for someone who's focused on dukkha, suffering, stress. And I think of that as a sense of surrender, and not kind of a letting go of kind of the push of intention. And just to say, for me, what's so interesting is that some of us, this language of timelessness doesn't really hit the spot, or space doesn't really hit the spot. But some of those other words for that doorway to the timeless, to deep time, to kairos, might actually really resonate. For me, I focus on dukkha. And so for me, that metric of surrender and somehow aligning with that dharma and letting it guide me, that's a very relevant language and metric for when I'm touching into that deeper strata of being or of not being, whatever. So I just want to bring that sutta to the fore because I think it's beautiful. So once again, that spaciousness focused on not self or emptiness, um, signlessness for those who focus on anicca, impermanence, and undirected uh, state based on those who focus on suffering.
Which sutta is it again, please, Ajahn?
Oh, these are such fun suttas. Majjhima Nikaya 43 and Majjhima Nikaya 44. They're a series of questions and answers between, the first is between Venerable Sariputta and another monk, and the second is between Venerable Dhammadinna, one of the foremost bhikkhunis, and her former husband, Visakha, who's a merchant.
I know, yes.
Yeah, and her a non-returner as well. So, yeah, they're such good suttas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Jay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's funny as you're giving this has happened before, but I took my granddaughter down to see the salmon running, and there was a dead salmon there. Of course, the whole thing's beautiful, right? The dead salmon, but that was kind of her first experience with. She's just shy of 3 years old. That was really her first experience with death, at least in my interactions with her. And it was just kind of curious through the day. I could see there's kind of this. She just had no clue what that meant. But towards the end of the day, when I was gone, her mom looked at it, said she kind of essentially gave a yoga fish pose on the floor when she was describing it to her mom. But the same thing. It's just kind of that kind of thing. Just kind of. Boils up in me too, the sadness, and all I can say in teaching my daughter is the granddaughter is just watching Charlotte's Web. But if you have any ideas how to teach a youngster emptiness, it's not dead, right? I mean, it's not a dead salmon, really. I get that, but I don't know. I just thought that was a cute thing where the granddaughter is actually doing the opposite. She's learning to kind of, I think, give that a formation when perhaps there's a lesson there that's more of just the beauty of life, and things are not bound by time. Anyway, it's more of if you have anything to offer to that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, anyone else know how to teach emptiness to a 3-year-old? If people want to raise their hand for this one, I would be interested. Former or parents. I would say just, and I genuinely meant that invitation. If people want, I'd be curious. But yeah, I mean, how to introduce death to a child is that's something I've never had to do. I really appreciate treating children, with a certain maturity and trying to speak to them about that. And I think there's a real truth and power. I think one of the jarring things around confronting death is really this seeing, a dead body and thinking that everything that was there is gone. Like there's a real sense of something missing. And granted, we could just write that off as a psychological reaction to seeing a dead body. But in a Buddhist framing, or a sort of a traditional one, you would say, actually the mind and goodness and karma carry on. But I think from a more secular, accessible framing for many, really just acknowledging this is the beauty of the Buddhist teaching of not self, is if we have our sort of an amalgamation of sankhara, of at least in part, of these patterns of behavior, good and negative. In Sanskrit, sankhara, volitional formations, actually is used often to speak about a ritual and a sacred ritual. And the sense of like we can make our sankhara, our patterns of life and of mental habit, sacred and very beautiful and bright. And just the sense of like, the brightness of this being, it carries on. And I think that's okay to say whether or not one believes in afterlife or rebirth. Like, the goodness we put into the world comes back. And there's a very famous story of Kafka finding a girl lost her doll in a park. And Kafka saw this, and Franz Kafka, and left a doll on her doorstep the next day with a little. Oh, sorry. What he would do is for the next few years, he'd mail this little girl letters from her doll as it traveled around the world, just telling her about all her stories. And then towards the end of her high school, she found a doll waiting for her on the porch. And years later, she found it had a little note tucked in its outfit that said, "You will lose everything you love, but the love will always come back to you in new forms." So that's one way I would speak about it, is that the goodness and the ripples we put into the world carry on. And I think that's a very valid Buddhist framing, whether or not one believes in rebirth or not. I'm not sure exactly what pattern salmon have in the world, but I assume there's some brightness there as well. Did that land okay?
Yeah, I think it's just nature, just concept of nature, and
Yeah.
what that, if it was a mother salmon or whatever, all that beauty that's going to continue on in the whole circle of life, I suppose. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and the Buddha also, he pointed out that the animal world's not all that great. It's pretty brutal out there, and animals are terrified like all the time, or hungry. And yeah, there is a beauty in the whole sort of, you can see beauty in that. But I think sometimes the kids are picking up on something with like, wow, this looks unpleasant.
And it could be a way to kind of want to bypass what was actually going on with her too, and trying not to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's dead. So, I mean, the physical form is dead. Yeah. Thank you.
Sadhu Jay. Bernie. And then this will be, I think, our last question.
Yes, thank you. So the last gentleman that shared brought up something for me is I teach with young children, and I have for many, many years. And I've always had just this kind of feeling of intuition that that somehow they're closer to these teachings than we are as adults. And what gets further from that is the layers of like this space-time dimension and the sufferings that we teach them. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernie. No, not especially. I think I mean I sense the same thing. Sometimes there's sometimes children really have deep intuition. But I don't know if I could make generalizations more than that. There is one Paulo Coelho quote I really love that's vaguely related. It's that when you're young, you know what you want, and then you lose your way, you forget. But life is kind and it gives you a second chance. And then you have a choice, which is to either to pay the price of living your own dream or your own story, or to spend your life living the story of another, meaning your spouse or your parent or someone else. And where I've taken that is just sometimes when a child is 8 or 9 or 12, you really do see a spark of their path in there. It's right there. And then we forget, like we go to college or get a job, and you lose yourself. But then I've so often seen that second chance or third or fourth chance where the spark comes back and you're given that choice. And what's beautiful in that quote for me is the acknowledgement that there's always a price to pay. Like that's how we make life sacred, is by sacrificing something. And usually there's a leap to make, So this doesn't speak to exactly what you're pointing to, Bernie, but I do find sometimes kids, from the mouths of babes, sometimes I find that children do have those deep insights. And yeah, maybe just if anyone has any sort of final tale of a child bringing that deep wisdom to them, then that would be a fun note to end on. But I think that's all I got on it. It's a great question. Suze, please.
When we started the Sunday sits at Seattle Insight, they were set up for parents to bring their young children with them. And the kids would be part of the meditation if they wanted, or play. And we always started the meditation with some direction for them. And we started every Dharma talk with a kid's book. And one day, this lovely 7 or 8 year old boy raised his hand at the end of the Dharma talk and asked this question, which was, so what's this all about, this living this life? What are we supposed to be doing? And it was such a beautiful question and my answer, it happened to be a day I was teaching, and my answer was every single person in this room has asked the same question, and the answer changes as the days go by. And it was such a beautiful thing. And it reminds us that the little ones are asking these questions. We just need to remember how you talk to an 8-year-old. It might be different than to a 40-year-old, but it was, we miss not being able to have the kids in the room anymore. It was really beautiful. So that could be a nice way of ending.
Thank you, Suze. I think that's a great way.